Okay, so here we go. Here's a good one. Let me finish this couple sentences and then you can respond, because we're agreeing that, ideally it should be treated. Obviously, you can choose to live with it and struggle with it.
Sure.
LGBT activists would like you to believe that transgender should be embraced, and thus the proper treatment is assisting the person in their transition to the opposite sex, or what they call, in a somewhat Orwellian manner, gender affirming care. Incredibly, they denounce any care that may help a person identify with their biological sex.
Well, this is because this has gone, I guess, if you will, too far. Again, I have never struggled with someone whose birth assigned gender is reinforced by some of the things you mentioned, whether it's toys or play or whatever. But where it goes too far is when you try to get a person who's obviously expressed feelings of gender dysphoria, and you try to treat that or reverse the processes that they've made towards transition. You reverse that with what they call reparative therapy, which is basically, brainwashing or trying to convince the person that they actually aren't transgender.
So you mentioned reparative therapy. We've interviewed some of those folks, and that is something that you do not subscribe to.
No, I think it's a really, it really gives the wrong message. I mean, it really is. In fact, it's been shown to be, psychologically devastating for many people.
Well, we'll get into that in a second, because, and I would love to see a debate between you and them, by the way, sometime.
Oh yeah, well, I would win that one. It's just
that's you just issued a challenge.
Oh, yeah.
And if they accept that challenge, it means that you're up for it.
Yeah. Well, I don't come up with corny numbers, and I just look at the person and say, it's just being a humanist or not. You need to be a human being first and foremost. And if you're a libertarian, if you have a libertarian vein in your body, you've got to, you just got to let people be who they are.
Yeah, well, I think what they would explain is that, first of all, the only people they're treating are people that have come to them. They don't do the thing where the parent drags the kid by the ear and throws them into the camp for 3 weeks, and they don't do the pray away the gay, et cetera. It's all voluntary, and it gets to, well, let me keep going with my little speech here, because we get to that. So what I say is, why not treat a disorder? You're going to disagree with the term disorder, but it still needs to be, but we agree that it needs to be treated. So let's just say dysphoria. So why not treat the diagnosis or dysphoria by trying to minimize or eliminate it? We do that with all other, I'm going to use the word, all other diagnoses, let's put it this way, such as bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive.
You're calling it a psychological, shame on you for that. That's just such a nasty thing to say. That's the old DSM, that's the Psychological Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that is used to define gender dysphoria as being a psychological disorder. And it's the same argument that was used to call being gay a psychological disorder.
Well,
same thing. In fact, only recently was this now dropped. Now this has been dropped from the DSM, and no longer does the World Health Organization consider gender dysphoria to be a disorder or a psychological diagnosis.
But I would argue that's all designed to reduce the stigma, which, in my opinion, there should not be a stigma for it at all. Just as there wouldn't be a stigma for any of the things I just mentioned, but you can't change the science simply to reduce stigma. So the question...
You're not changing the science. The science, if you want to talk about the science is that every other measure of biology is represented by diversity. And what we have done in our society is we've taken an artificial stance where we have doubled down on this notion of having good and evil, black and white, and male and female. And we've made it a simple, like a litmus test. You want a litmus test for what's male and what's female, and therefore never the two shall cross. And all of the zones, all of that region in between is verboten and not to be negotiated.
Well,
and the fact is that biologically, the notion of gender identity is represented by diversity. And there is no person on the planet, or very few anyway, other than maybe Tom Brady and Gisele Bündchen, who are truly polar males and females, people who are 10 on a gender spectrum or 1 on a gender spectrum. That most of us lie somewhere in between in regards to our gender identity. And that is the biological fact.
Yeah, but what we're talking about primarily is when there is significant dysphoria to the point where it requires some form of treatment, and you've got a lot of parents putting their children on puberty blockers. You have a lot of them ultimately deciding to do sex reassignment surgery. So there's treatments going on there for this, for, I guess, what you would consider the extreme amounts of dysphoria. You're saying that, hey, there's a spectrum. Everyone has some level of dysphoria, let's say, or at least a good percentage of the population have some level of dysphoria, but some of it becomes to such an extent that it's impacting their day-to-day life to the point where they're seeking treatment.
Yes, well, we've also, as society, unfairly given people only 2 boxes that they can kind of live in. And it is possible that in time, that maybe if there was more acceptance of people living not necessarily at one or the other extreme, that maybe there would be fewer surgeries and a lesser desire for hormones. But right now, we have a binary system. I mean, there is an emerging group of people who seek to live non-binary, and they're not necessarily seeking hormones or surgery. They're living somewhere in between.
But if someone has a XY chromosome, which means that they are male, correct?
Sorry, no, it doesn't. I just told you the examples. That a large number.
Okay. I was just making sure that I got it right, that XY is male and XX is female, because I get those backwards sometimes.
It's not. It's
okay, not always. Okay,
not always. If you have a penis, then okay, I'll say that. Okay, let's just start with that. Let's say if you have a penis, because you got to drop that chromosomal thing because there's too many exceptions to it.
So, let's just say hypothetically you're XY and you've got a penis and testicles, okay, and you're a 5-year-old, but you're identifying as a female, okay. The boy is expressing to his parents, why do you keep calling me a boy? I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. I want to wear girls' clothes. I want to hang up. So how could that be anything other than psychological?
How can that be anything psychological? Well,
other than psychological, if he has a penis and testicles and he's XY, but he's saying I identify as female, where else would that come from but his brain?
Once again, gender identity trumps genitalia. So gender identity always trumps genitalia.
Okay, so I'm with. I mean, I can acknowledge that there's a distinction between gender identity and chromosomal gender. So what you've got is you've now got a boy who's gender identifying as a girl, even though he has a penis and testicles and he's XY. So the question is what to do as if you're a parent in that situation. And number one, number two, I say, how could it be anything other than psychological and be in his brain if he's XY and has a penis and testicles? So I don't understand why you get worked up when I suggest that it's something psychological.
I don't know why it has to be in the brain, because it's not psychological. It's biological. It's what they.
Okay, but where is it if it's not in the brain?
Okay, well, again, it's not just in the brain, because It could be it's a component. It's a biological makeup of what that child is, which is a combination of anatomy, genetics, hormones, imprinting, fetal imprinting.
But nothing to do with psychological.
Psychological has is part of that, is part of the makeup, but it isn't a purely psychological problem. That's all I'm trying to tell you. It's not so boiling it down to a purely psychological problem is not only, it's pejorative, it's inflammatory, and it's not accurate.
Yeah. Well, I don't know why it's so pejorative and so inflammatory. I don't think that it should be, but that's kind of the crux of my argument, is that for some reason
because then if it's psychological, that means it's malleable and it's amenable to change. That's the argument. That's the natural conclusion by stating that.
But it does change, and people say all the time how they change in their fluid and they go from one side to the other. So trans community seems to be open to the idea that it can be fluid throughout your lifetime. But now you're suggesting that, oh, no, it's not malleable. So which is it? Is it malleable or not?
It doesn't matter. The malleability isn't the issue. You're trying to make the malleability make it a psychological issue.
Well, I'm saying at least in part it's psychological. Are you willing to acknowledge at least in
that's
part?
what I said. That's what I said. It's the who you are and how gender identity is established is a myriad, very complex formula.
Okay. So
you emerges before the age of 6, and that's the important point.
And based on the people I spoke to, I totally agree with that it's at a very young age. So if you're willing to acknowledge that psychology plays some role in it, what role does it play? And what would make a boy at 6 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, from a psychological perspective, be more inclined to identify female?
Well, this is why generations of guilt has been heaped upon parents, because you have a child who's very slight, who's very feminine appearing, whose spermatic cords are very short, probably, who runs lower levels of testosterone relative to her peers, let's say, and her brain set she feels that she's female, not male. How do you go to that person and say, oh, no, you're really a boy, you just need to macho up, you need to tough it up, you need to body build, and we need to get you, work on your brain to make you the John Wayne you were meant to be?
Well, if hormones,
it's bullshit. So it's horse shit. It's just folly. It's trying to it's the notion that every boy child has the potential to be either a Tom Brady or a killer. I mean, this is all militarism that fuels this notion that we need to have our boys are potential soldiers. It's just simply not true.
Well, but we're starting from the premise that gender dysphoria is something that we would prefer to prevent if possible, and ultimately,
I wouldn't say prefer to prevent it. Again, you're making a judgment on it that aspect. This isn't a new thing. This goes back to the popes, the ancient times, literature, mythology, art, history. They all attempted to explain what were then intersex conditions, but they were just an extension. All intersex conditions are genital diversity, and all transgender is brain diversity. It's just diversity in the brain about the sense of maleness and femaleness.